a Russian fighter jet and called Moscow the aggressor. How does that work? And then they called Team NATO and complained that Russia violated its airspace. Russia was like, what? Violated? Not exactly. You shot down our jet, killed a pilot, and had cameras handy to film it all. Looks planned. But why do all this? Maybe...
Based on our data, I provided examples of the financing of different Islamic State units in different countries by private individuals. Financing, as we have established, comes from 40 countries, and there are some of the G20 states among them.
And now you call NATO and cry bully. NATO was like, yes, Turkey, we kind of support you, but...
I look forward to further contacts between Ankara and Moscow, and I call for calm and de-escalation. Diplomacy and de-escalation, calm and de-escalation, de-escalating the situation.
Okay, fine, we get it. Calm. Anything different from the U.S.?
I think it's very important right now for us to make sure that both the Russians and the Turks are talking to each other.
Joining me in the now is retired Turkish Admiral Sonush Polat, who's also the former head of intelligence department of the Turkish General Staff and a member of the Patriotic Party. Thanks so much for being with us. My first question is simple. Why did Turkey shoot down the Russian jet? Is this about an airspace violation? Because, of course, Russia denies that.
Yes, ma'am. It is absolutely certain that downing of Russian aircraft is an unfortunate incident working to the detriment of both Turkey and Russia. In my opinion, it is a historical mistake which I believe should have been avoided. But unfortunately, it happened. This is the plain truth standing in front of us, and we should fight against this fact.
Russia claims that this was planned by Turkey, but what would be the point of that? I mean, what would Turkey gain from this?
A very good question, and if you allow me, I would like to extend my sincere condolences on my own behalf and on behalf of the Turkish people over the death of Russian pilot to the Russian people, because we as Turkish people felt very sorry for the death. And at this very, very critical stage, I am of the opinion that it is of no benefit to Turkey and Russia. And, you know, Western powers tried hard to stage the same games in the history, to make Turkey and Russia fight each other. And if you look back history, we found they won. And this is a clear trap, and we should not fall into this trap. Turkey and Russia have been enjoying very friendly relations over the years based on mutual interests. You know, energy cooperation, tourism cooperation, trade cooperation, and a huge amount of investment by the Turkish companies in Russia, etc.
It would seem on the surface that both countries understood this partnership. I mean, just over a week ago, we saw Russia and Turkey meeting each other, shaking hands at the G20. That's on the surface, but what is hidden from the public eye in terms of strategic relations between Turkey and Russia?
As a matter of fact, in my opinion, Turkish people attach particular importance with our relations with Russia. And I can feel it over the streets, homes, cafes. So we as Patriotic Party trying, you know, to rectify this friendly relations, so we don't want to further trigger some worse actions.
Retired Turkish Admiral Sonush Polat, who also is a former head of intelligence department of the Turkish General Staff and a member, like you heard, of the Patriotic Party. Thanks so much for being in the Now.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
Well, media accounts of this incident not only varied, but some of them simply didn't make sense. From numbers not adding up to claims so false, they become kind of funny.
The Turkish media is saying that this plane violated their airspace 10 times within 5 minutes, and during this 10 times, they sent out a warning to this plane.
Vladimir Putin keeps saying that Turkey is aiding ISIS. Is that true?
The Russians, especially when you're flying near an enemy area like Turkey to the Russians, you would definitely be listening to guards. The other big thing is this. Look, the Russians are not as good as people give them credit for. They think they're somehow, you know, the equivalent of the United States military. They're not.
What do you think Putin's thinking tonight?
Well, I think he's probably pretty embarrassed.
Vladimir Putin, the president, has also tweeted. He's tweeted several things regarding this. Turkey says that Russia invaded their airspace. Russia says that they did not. Who do you believe?
I believe Turkey.
Well, NATO and the U.S. understandably are not laughing. A Russian jet being shot down by an alliance member for the first time since the Cold War is very serious, and all global players know this. Let's bring in James Carden of The Nation. He's also a former advisor at the State Department. James, good to see you again. NATO and Washington both reacted by basically urging, at least setting the tone, that things should stay calm and that Russia and Turkey need to deal with this together. Is that the way to go here?
Well, I think a call for calm is the way to go. I think that the reaction in the West has been singularly devoid of facts, and they are intentionally misleading the American public and the Western public as to what exactly happened.
Why would they do this?
Well, for one thing, Turkey is supposedly an ally of ours. Well, they are an ally of ours. They are a NATO ally, and we are covering for them, and we have been covering for them for since this crisis began in 2011.
Russia claims that this was a planned move. Why would Turkey do something like that? What could they possibly gain from this?
I think the Turks' motives are twofold. The first thing is that they are complicit. As Vladimir Putin said, that the Turkish government are the accomplices of terror. The second thing, Mr. Putin committed what the French would call lèse-majesté when he went to the G20 summit. And he called out Erdogan and other G20 members on their material support for to ISIS.
So he basically crossed the line by calling Turkey out on the global stage. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Many Russians are quite critical of Moscow's reaction, saying it was too soft. How do you think Moscow could react to something like this?
Well, I hope that cooler heads prevail. There seems to be a rush to corner Russia and to push Russia aside in the West. I've seen the news coverage that there have been protests outside the Turkish embassy in Moscow, and that's understandable. But I don't think that we want to bring the two nuclear-armed blocs into further confrontation.
Airspace
and I very seriously doubt that.
Go ahead.
That Vladimir Putin intends to do that.
Airspace violation accounts, they vary, obviously, here. How valid is a justification violating someone's airspace, especially from another country that violates Syria's and Greece's airspace all the time? And Greece is literally asking the question of why is Turkey allowed to violate our airspace when they shoot down jets that they say violate theirs? Yeah,
it's no justification at all. Turkey, by some accounts, has violated Greece's airspace over 2,000 times in the last year. And even the former #2 general in the United States Air Force, Tom McInerney, went on Fox News and said that it's no justification at all. And he used to run NORAD in Alaska. So violations of airspace are very common. What is uncommon is shooting a plane down for it.
How relevant is it that a jet has been shot down for the first time, a Russian jet, by a NATO country since the Cold War? I mean, this is very, very serious.
It's extremely serious, and it was an extremely provocative, reckless, and stupid thing for the Turks to do. They're a NATO ally, and what they are doing by this ridiculous stunt that they just pulled, dragging NATO into a confrontation with nuclear-armed Russia. And the reaction to point the finger of blame at Putin for this is utterly absurd.
Where are we now? I mean, what's next? I assume there are two ways this could go.
Well, what's next? I think a lot hinges on what's going on in Russia with the meeting of French President Hollande and Mr. Putin. Remember that Hollande did not invoke NATO's Article 5, right? He went to the European Union instead. And I think that opens up a way for greater cooperation between at least some of the European countries and Russia.
Well, let's hope so. James Carden of The Nation with us. He's also a former advisor at the U.S. State Department. Thanks, James, for being in the know.
Thank you.
Coming up, we look at the countries propping up the stolen ISIS multi-million-dollar oil market. Stay in the know.
Crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want.
So much of what the NSA has been doing, so much of what the US does to gather intelligence is controlled and run by private corporations. That to me is still outsourcing war. I think one of the things that really comes out so strongly in the Snowden documents, which is so relevant, is what the US and its allies mostly want the intelligence for is not, despite what they claim, to fight terrorism, but actually to give their corporations economic benefit when it comes to making money.
We are so discredited after the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, the chaos we caused there, the overthrow of Gaddafi, which made matters worse. The West has a terrible record of intervening only for its own interests. We've got to demonstrate a broader coalition.
ISIS oil get to the official market through middlemen who then smuggle the black gold to Turkey and beyond. Exactly. Why is no one stopping them if it's so obvious? Fighting terrorists at any cost is the main goal, isn't it? At least that's what they say.
Make no mistake, we will win, and groups like ISIL will lose.
We have to hit these terrorists in their heartlands right now.
Terrorism is our common enemy.
Joining me in the now is independent Syrian MP Maria Sadeh. She's in Rome, Italy at the moment. Thank you so much for being with us. Even after terror attacks in France, officials, including the French president, insist that Bashar al-Assad must go. Maybe they're a little less persistent about a time frame, but what I want to ask you is, will this help the fight against ISIS, this push for Assad to go, even after we see ISIS reach Europe's borders?
Yes, I think after 5 years of the war against Syria and facing this terrorism and all this whole information with the government and with the President Bashar al-Assad, is it good for the interest of Syrian people to leave now? I don't think so. For sure, we need him because he is the key to continue this war against terrorism. And the terrorism today is not just in Syria. They cross the borders, and we can find the terrorism in Lebanon and even in France. So how we can consider that he can leave this place without any leaders and without any the whole accumulated information to fighting against the terrorist group.
Why do you think we have European leaders still talking about this? There's no doubt that they are also victims of terror. Should this not draw them together? To us, it seems obvious, but why would the French president, U.S. officials, UK officials still be talking about this when they see the terror?
Yes. If we go back 2 years, 3 years ago, we can compare the opposition of the France, or the position of the France. It was against the terrorists in Mali, and they support terrorism in Syria. And also, Fabius declared 2-3 years ago that Al-Nusra did a good job. So they couldn't, they distinguish between some organization terrorists and between others. Today they want to fight ISIS, against ISIS, but they still support Al-Nusra. So what they understand, how they can understand the terrorism which happened in Paris. So this is the question. If they take the real notion and the real image about the terrorists existing today in Syria and even outside of Syria. So I think there is a difference between the notion of each state against the terrorist group. That's why we can't face the same action of coalition against terrorists between, for example, Russia and some Occident state like France.
I want to talk about the Syrian opposition. I mean, you're an independent MP. How do Syrians see coming out of this situation? I mean, realistically, it's changed a lot over the past 5 years, like you say. What's a way out, according to the Syrian people inside the country?
Yeah, first of all, we have to distinguish between fighting terrorist group and a political solution, because political solution, that's mean what we want for the future for Syria. And for sure, the door is open for all Syrians to be collaborated and put the vision and to collaborate also in building the political solution and the new future for Syria. And the Syrian government is open today for the inside opposition or the national opposition, when I think all Syrians, wherever it is, if they are in the society, opposition, pro-regimes, so all, if they want the best for Syria, we should protect Syria, so we should have the same the same decision and the same action against a terrorist group or against terrorism in general. So we need to save Syria. So we have to collaborate all together for the future and for the interest of Syrian people.
What can Syria's direct neighbors like Turkey, Saudi Arabia, just to name a few, do to encourage peace? Because right now there's a lot of action that seems to be counterproductive.
I don't think through 5 years they encourage peace, but for sure they support terrorist organizations since the beginning of the crisis and the beginning of the war against Syria, in direct way or indirect way. Because we know exactly that there is a lot of general in the Turkish army. They generate fighting with the terrorist organization in the north of Syria against Syrian army. So
MP Maria Saadeh, thank you so much for being with us in the Now.
Thank you so much.
Black dash and white dash. Black is ISIS, white, Saudi Arabia. Why? Black dash slits throats, kills, stones, cuts off hands, but white dash is better dressed and neat. It does many of the same things, though. A New York Times op-ed brutally points this out. Kamel Daoud says the West wages war on one, but shakes hands with the other, produces, legitimizes, spreads, preaches and defends Wahhabism, the ultra-puritanical form of Islam that Daesh feeds on. Daesh has a mother, the invasion of Iraq, hard to argue with. Its father, according to the author, is Saudi Arabia and its religious industrial complex. And until that factor is weighed in, fighting ISIS is pointless. Drugs, weapons, prescription pills, dozens of underground tunnels discovered in Iraq have revealed details of the ISIS terror network and how they have survived this long. New York City's mafia has put its 2 cents into the war against ISIS. They claim that they'll do a better job at protecting citizens of the Big Apple than FBI or Homeland Security. That's not a bad offer on the table.
I'm going to make him an offer he can't refuse.
It's not personal. It's strictly business.
The last time you're going to see a bad guy like this again. Let me say hello to my little friend.
That does it for me this week. I'll see you next Sunday. Till then, it's now or never.
I can't watch my society rot when a bunch of federal want to just throw anybody that they disagree with in a prison cell. It's the end of the Western right now.
Information is the weapon.
Hackers are important in the sense that they have the capacity to expose the secret or the inner workings of the state, which is why they are terrified of hackers and they are going after them with phenomenal vengeance.
We're gaining back the freedoms that the forefathers assured us through technology, and we can't allow these freedoms to be taken away.
عملت ايه يا كبد؟ شاور يا بيض، شاور على صورة بابا. حط ايدك لتحت كده. جوزي ملاك راح السما.
بعد ظهور الفيديو العجيب هنا ان الناس كلها كانت بتصلي من اجل داعش.
دول دخلاء علشان يشوهوا صورة الإسلام، لأن الإسلام ده دين الرحمة.
أي نعم إن الخوف كان مالينا، عايزين نهرب منهم، بس لو كنا نعرف إن آخرتهم كده درجة عظيمة كنا فتحنا ورحنا معاهم.
حياتي زي الزفت والله، ولا رايح عن بالي دقيقة.
فلما منظر حمية، بس مين اللي هيتكلموا تاني؟
Changing climate, changing fauna, changing social life, changing financial circumstances, changing values, changing culture, changing life.
The economy in North Dakota was flat. People were just getting by. But now, thanks to the discovery of oil, the town is now changing.
There's new homes, new businesses. It has been booming.
This has been a challenge and an opportunity, but still a challenge.
The stories which shaped the week here on RT International. Turkey downs a Russian bomber near the Syrian border, saying it violated its airspace. But Moscow insists the jet was attacked in Syrian skies. As one of the jet's pilots parachuted to the ground, he was shot dead by Turkmen militia. It's claimed their leader is a Turkish citizen with an ultra-nationalist background. Also, RT journalists come under attack in Syria as an anti-tank missile fired from a rebel-held area narrowly misses their car. Hello there, welcome to our look back at the last 7 days. You're watching the weekly here on RT International. Now, the downing of a Russian military aircraft by Turkish fighter jets near the Syrian border on Tuesday continues to dominate the headlines. It is the first time a NATO country has shot down a Russian aircraft in half a century.
Allahu Akbar! Allahu Akbar! سقوط طائرة روسية! Allahu Akbar!
The whole world should be aware that we can defend ourselves and will take any necessary precautions to protect and secure our nation.
Today's loss is a stab in the back from terrorist accomplices.
Show you a map of the Russian jet's flight path released by Turkey's military, where it's seen entering a small region of Turkish airspace jutting into Syria. However, Moscow's data here shows the plane was shot down around 1 kilometre from the Syrian-Turkish border. We'll Well, in a leaked letter to the UN, Ankara said the Su-24 was warned 10 times over a period of 5 minutes. But the document also states that the jet's intrusion into Turkish airspace lasted only 17 seconds. It's actually just taken me more time to explain both countries' versions of the incident than for the Turkish warplanes to react and attack the jet. Aviation lawyer Elmar Gumula says that even if the Russian aircraft did enter Turkey, it didn't pose a threat.
This plane has, if at all, just touched Turkish airspace and not really violated. This happens all over the place. It happens every day. Violation of international law must be done intentionally, firstly, and this must be combined with a kind of threat to the neighboring country, and nothing of this sort can be seen here in this case. If a foreign plane crosses your airspace without any approval of the government, then of course you have the possibility either to force it to land or to leave your airspace. So this plane has left the airspace. There was no reason to enforce anything. It has done it voluntarily. The only thing which could have been done is, of course, a kind of diplomatic protest note.
Well, the two Russian pilots managed to eject from the aircraft after it came under attack. Both pilots could be seen parachuting from the plane, as you can see here, but as they tried to land safely over an area held by Syrian militants, they came under attack from the ground. One of the pilots was shot dead while still in the air. The rebel group controlling the region has since handed the body of Oleg Peskov to Turkey. His remains will be given to Russia on Sunday. Well, after Peshkov's death, the militants released a video reportedly showing them celebrating the killing while standing over his body. You might find the footage disturbing.
لا إله إلا الله يا شباب كل المجاهدين.
From the way they look, from the terms they were using as well, you know, these jihadist terms which are usually used by Al-Qaeda or its affiliates, we can safely assume that it's, you know, one of the extremist groups who share the same takfiri ideology as ISIS and as, and like Jabhat al-Nusra. It's safe to say they're from the same school of thought.
Well, the navigator of the Su-24 was rescued, escaping almost certain death, not once, but 3 times. Initially, both the pilot and the navigator, as we said, successfully ejected from the aircraft after it was hit by a Turkish missile. The navigator then managed to avoid militant gunfire from the ground as he parachuted down. The pilot was not so lucky, though, and took a deadly hit while still in the air. The navigator was unhurt but landed in militant-controlled territory, and a joint rescue operation by both the Syrian and Russian military was launched right away. They managed to locate the navigator and transport him to safety despite coming under heavy gunfire. Later on, he spoke to reporters.
There were no warnings, neither by radio nor visual. There was no contact at all. That's why we were taking the route as usual. And the rocket hit the tail of our jet, suddenly. We didn't even see it coming. We were at a height of some 6,000 meters. The weather was clear. I was completely in control of the flight until the moment the rocket exploded. I saw everything on the map and on the ground. There was no possibility of us crossing into Turkey. We made the flights lots of times. I know the route very well.
Well, this unverified footage emerged on a website run by a Syrian opposition group after the Russian jet was shot down. Militants are seen here firing a missile. The next shot then shows a helicopter being destroyed. Some reports suggest it was a Russian aircraft sent to rescue the pilots of the downed jet. While the video has not yet been verified, Russia's defense ministry has confirmed one of its helicopters was hit, killing 1 serviceman. The missile in the video is reportedly an American-made Tau anti-tank missile. It has a range of more than 4 kilometres and has been covertly supplied to Syrian militants since 2014. Hundreds of similar missile systems have been spotted in the hands of numerous rebel groups. Details have emerged about the militant commander who boasted of killing the Russian pilot. It appears that the militia leader who controls the rebels responsible for shooting the pilot after he ejected from the jet is allegedly a Turkish citizen with an ultra-nationalist background. Here's William Whiteman with more.
Shortly after Turkey shot down the Russian warplane, these fighters boasted online that they'd machine-gunned a Russian pilot attempting to parachute to safety.
Our comrades opened fire into the air. We all did. The pilots died in the air. Our fighters will bring the bodies here.
If so, then that constitutes a war crime under the Geneva Convention. The militants themselves were identified as Syrian Turkmen rebels fighting against President Assad. Only there's something more about the leader of this group, who's allegedly not even a Turkmen, but simply Turkish. Several Turkish outlets have previously written about a son of an ex-mayor of a Turkish province who left the country to fight for Turkmen abroad. It was confirmed to us by several investigative journalists.
I found out that he's actually from Turkey. He's from Elazığ province of Turkey in East Turkey, and his name is Alparslan Çelik, and he is the son of ex-mayor of a sub-district in Elazığ province.
Alparslan Çelik is the son of the former MHP mayor. Alparslan Çelik was in Iraq before he went to Syria. In 2014, Ramazan Çelik said in an interview that he knows that his son is in Iraq and he's also proud of him.
And in this photograph, we can see the fighter in question posing in front of the flag of the militant Turkish nationalist organisation, the Grey Wolves. He's even making the signature hand salute of the group. But who are the Grey Wolves? Well, they're the youth wing of the Nationalist Movement Party, often abbreviated to the MHP, a hard-right political organisation and one of the 4 major players in Turkish politics. Despite voicing criticism of Erdogan, they have collaborated with his Justice and Development Party on a range of issues and have been accused by critics of acting as the ruling party's lifeline. With pictures circulating online, it would appear to some as if the bedfellows of Turkish politics are once again working together, if indirectly. Erdogan's government gave the order to shoot down the plane, and the Grey Wolves supporter just happened to be there on the ground and finished off the job by killing one of the pilots.
And as William mentioned there, the ultra-nationalist Grey Wolves group is no stranger to controversy. Well, the decision to shoot down the Russian jet contradicts a number of statements made by President Erdogan himself just a few years ago. Back in 2012, the then Prime Minister was infuriated after Syria downed a Turkish fighter jet following an airspace violation.
A short-term border violation can never be a pretext for an attack. Even if the plane was in airspace for a few seconds, there is no excuse to attack. The Russian plane was in Turkish airspace for 17 seconds. The F-16 shot down the Russian plane in line with Turkish rules of engagement.
Airspace violations are incidents that happen almost every day and are resolved in a matter of minutes within international law.
Well, a Russian plane violated Israeli airspace earlier today. In a radio broadcast, Israel's defence minister said the Russian plane flew 1.6 kilometres into Israeli airspace. But shortly after being contacted, the situation was resolved and the Russian pilot flew back into Syria. Moshe Yalon, said because the Russian plane did not intend to attack Israel, there was no need to automatically shoot it down over a small error. Well, right after the downing of the Russian jet on the Syrian border, Turkey called for an emergency NATO meeting instead of immediately contacting Moscow. The reaction of the world leaders was reserved, with calls for the nations to avoid further tensions.
I think it's very important right now for us to make sure that both the Russians and the Turks are talking to each other, find out exactly what happened, and take measures to discourage any kind of escalation.
What we are calling for now is calm and de-escalation.
We should avoid any escalation, which would be extremely damaging.
This means that we may experience a setback in the Syria peace talks, and also that the hope of solving the conflict could vanish.
Well, we asked experts about the international reaction to the plane's downing.
I guess I was immediately concerned that NATO might buy in to the insanity being demonstrated by Turkey. Fortunately, the reports coming out of the NATO meeting indicate that several of the NATO ministers were asking Turkey, you know, what in God's name were you thinking? There are other ways to handle this without firing. These countries need to come together because there is one threat that should unite us, which is this rise of radical Sunni Islam.
If one nation like Turkey decides that it is going to have a more robust approach to the Russian operations in Syria than other nations, yes, that does benefit ISIS. The last thing we need is there to be some fracture between the Russians and the coalition, who are all, at the end of the day, wanting to see a peaceful and stable Syria. If that is the aim, we all need to work for it.
Following the downing of its jet, Russia deployed its advanced S-400 air defence missile system in Syria. Moscow said it's meant to ensure the safety of its aircraft during operations against ISIL and other terrorist groups in Syria. Well, the S-400 is designed to engage up to 80 targets at the same time. Its maximum range is 400 kilometres, which means it can destroy any type of military aircraft across Syria. Experts say the Russian missiles are incredibly fast, powerful and precise. Russia's Air Force has stepped up its efforts against Islamic State's main source of income, the terrorist oil empire. The illegal crude is smuggled into Turkey on an industrial scale. The jihadists make billions of dollars selling cheap crude on the black market, making ISIL the richest terrorist organisation possibly ever. Ankara's role in the trade was touched on in the British Parliament immediately following the downing of the Russian bomber.
They've shot down a Russian jet who are also trying to fight ISIL. They're buying oil from ISIL in order to prop them up. They're bombing the Kurds who are also fighting ISIL. This Syrian engagement is an almighty mess.
Well, I see, Mr. Speaker, that old habits die hard, and the honourable gentleman remains an apologist for Russian actions. On the question of Turkey, Turkey is an important NATO ally, and it will remain a very important partner for this country and for the European Union.
Turkey, so directly targeted Russia. I'm very surprised because I think it's a little bit suicidal. That being said, I think that it speaks a lot as to how threatened Turkey feels in terms of its financial connections to ISIL, and it actually confirms, if anything, that Turkey, does indeed have very deep-seated ties with terrorists and radicals across the region.
Well, Turkey's been frequently accused of being reluctant to fight terrorists, with questions raised over its alleged ties to radicals.
Türkiye olarak terörle mücadeleye ilişkin işbirliğinin geliştirilmesi konusundaki kararlılığımızın daha güçlü bir şekilde ifade edilmesi gerektiğini
Turkish warplanes went on the attack Monday, but instead of pounding ISIL positions in Syria, the Turks attacked Kurdish fighters in Turkey.
What the? So all over in Kobani, we've been bombing ISIS to help the Kurds. Our good friend Turkey has at the same time, just a few miles away, been bombing Kurds, thereby helping ISIS.
Turkey has become the destination for the oil, which has been captured by the ISIL army.
Если у них, у ИГИЛ, такие деньги, а счет идет там на десятки, сотни миллионов, может быть, на миллиарды долларов, плюс к этому они имеют защиту со стороны вооруженных сил целого государства, тогда понятно, почему они ведут себя так дерзко и нагло.
Well, coming up after the break, the British Parliament debates support for airstrikes in Syria. But it appears the British public is already rejecting the idea. We'll tell you more in a couple of minutes.
Do we speak your language? Want news, programs and documentaries in Arabic? It's all here on RT. Reporting from the world's hotspots, VIP interviews, intriguing stories. Are you here? Then try RT Arabic. To find out more, visit arabic.rt.com.
The government thought their proposal for a merger was going to be a boom, but alas, it turned out to be a bust.
We're in exactly the same crisis, only the situation is more dire now than it has ever been.
The question then becomes, what happens when you have an economic downturn?
China has pledged to contribute a total of $41 billion to the bank.
Beijing has to keep it going.
Some fundraisers are predicting the next election could cost $5 billion.
Welcome back. Now, Russian journalists came under fire in Syria this week, their car narrowly avoiding a direct missile strike. RT reporters were among those that were injured. The attack took place in the northern Syrian region of Latakia as the journalists were passing through a mountain village held by government forces. It came from the direction of the town of Salma, which is to the east of the site and controlled by rebels. Well, a video posted online allegedly shows Syrian rebels firing an American-made anti-tank missile at the car carrying the Russian journalists. We can show you the moment when a Syrian rebel supposedly fires on the convoy. Two of our correspondents were in one of the cars. You can see one of them in the red circle there on the right, running for cover. Fortunately, the journalists have now returned safely to Russia, though clearly they were shaken by the attack.
Very happy to be home. Can't wait to see my family. That was the hardest thing to do, is to let my family know what happened to me.
I just want to say sorry for my wife, for my family. Good, everything good.
We were attacked from an opposite mountain from where we were. That place is still controlled by the international terrorist groups. The rocket that landed on us, I couldn't tell whether it was moderate or not, but the explosion was quite loud, and we did receive a concussion. Sargon here, he still has a piece of shrapnel in his body. You know, when something like that happens to you, I don't know what's moderate and what's not. You know, we were attacked. We were clearly marked as journalists in accordance.
Attacked journalists. We saw them because they shot at first the first rocket, and then the second one, and then third, fourth, and fifth one.
And I also want to add that as soon as the news came out about us being shot in Syria, so-called opposition groups in Syria posted our photos online right away with the words of, kill them. What else?
We'll find you.
We'll find you. So we were threatened after we were shot at. We were additionally threatened by local terrorist groups or international terrorist groups, and our pictures are now posted online everywhere with words, kill these guys.
Well, thousands of people gathered outside Downing Street in London on Saturday trying to get one message across to the government: don't bomb Syria. Britain is involved in airstrikes against Islamic State in Iraq, but the government is yet to get Parliament's approval for military action in Syria. More than a dozen protests were held across the country.
We think that it will kill innocent British service people who don't necessarily want to be in this kind of conflict. We think it will cost money that the government says it hasn't got. We think it will increase Islamophobia here at home. So for all these reasons, we think that Cameron's war drive is a mistake, and it's a mistake as big as the Iraq war was a mistake.
Well, British Prime Minister David Cameron has been pushing for strikes on Syria for years. Last time, though, the vote didn't go as planned.
It is clear to me that the British Parliament, reflecting the views of the British people, does not want to see British military action. I get that, and the government will act accordingly.
To avoid another failure, Cameron promised to hold a vote only on the issue only if he was sure he would win. But one unpredictable factor is the anti-war stance of opposition leader Jeremy Corbyn.
If not now, when? Does the Prime Minister believe that the United Nations Security Resolution 2249 gives clear and unambiguous authorisation for UK airstrikes? And in the absence of any coordinated UN military or diplomatic strategy, does he believe that more military forces over Syria could increase the risks of dangerous incidents, such as the shooting down of a Russian military aircraft by Turkish forces this week?
Well, former senior naval officer Chris Parry thinks the United Nations should take the lead in solving the Syrian crisis.
Well, I was against bombing 2 years ago because I didn't think there was a coherent strategy either by the United Kingdom or indeed by the United States at the time. And I think at the last minute, people looked away and said, absolutely, that's right. I still think we're short of an overall international strategy to defeat Islamic State. I think we are doing it in penny packets. Each country is getting on with its own operation as it understands it. And we really do need the United Nations to take charge here. We've got almost all of the permanent members of the Security Council involved in combat operations. We've got a UN resolution that says people can take necessary measures against Islamic State. And the organisation itself has not stepped up to the plate.
Now, in other news this hour, police used stun grenades and tear gas to disperse protesters in Paris, taking part in a climate change demonstration that had been banned. The march against climate change had been cancelled by the authorities for security reasons in the wake of the 13th of November attacks that killed 130 people in the city. The demonstration comes a day before the two-week-long United Nations Climate Change Conference that will take place in Paris. US President Barack Obama and China's Xi Jinping will be among more than 140 leaders attending the start of the summit. You've been watching The Weekly here on RT. We'll have more in about 30 minutes' time. Up next, though, it's Worlds Apart.
Северный морской путь – это дорога из запада на восток, вдоль наших территорий.
На острове Хейса все у нас сотрудники станции.
Сейчас за Арктику идет борьба среди всех стран. Если мы ее сейчас не освоим, то освоит за нас кто-то другой.
Changing climate, changing fauna, changing social life, changing financial circumstances, changing values, changing culture, changing life.
The economy in North Dakota was flat. People were just getting by. But now, thanks to the discovery of oil, the town is now changing.
There's new homes, new businesses. It has been booming.
This has been a challenge and an opportunity, but still a challenge.
Welcome to Worlds Apart. American President Franklin Roosevelt famously said during World War II that he did not want to see a single war millionaire created in the United States as a result of that global disaster. 70 years later, catastrophes come with huge losses for some and even bigger profits for others. Has making money on misery become an industry model? Well, to discuss it, I'm now joined by author and journalist Anthony Lovenstein. Mr. Lovenstein, it's a great pleasure to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me on.
Now, you recently published a book entitled Disaster Capitalism, and it kicks off with a quote from Professor Jorgen Randers, who said that it is profitable to let the world go to hell. And arguably, there is nothing new in this statement. There have always been dogs of war. But I think your argument is that capitalism made it not only more systematic, but also more acceptable.
Very much so. As you rightly say, people have been making money from wars and other things for hundreds of years, so that's not particularly new. What I think has changed in the last 30 years, particularly since the 1980s in America and Britain, but also more widely, including in Russia, is the sense that the globalized nature of corporations. So to the point where I look in the book in places like Afghanistan, Haiti, Papua New Guinea, America, Britain, Greece and Australia, how people in areas of immigration, war, aid and development and also mining are in some ways have become more powerful than the state. And to me, as someone who thinks that a corporation should not be more powerful than the state, that is a deep problem for human rights and also for accountability and transparency.
Mm-hmm. And if I'm not mistaken, a similar thesis was explored in Naomi Klein's book, The Shock Doctrine, and you make it very clear that you're sort of trying to build on that. But from my point of view, the main difference between your works is not only the different historical periods that you consider, but also the fact that she puts a much greater emphasis on the ideological underpinnings that, you know, the University of Chicago's ethos of deregulation and privatization.
Yeah.
But in your book, you don't see much of that, and I wonder why. Does the brand of disaster capitalism that you consider a much more contemporary one, does it even need political and economic justification for what it is doing?
When I read Naomi Klein's book, The Shock Doctrine, in 2007, I was inspired by what she wrote, and in some ways I was, as you said, trying to build on that argument. I wasn't ignoring the ideological background of the ideology, whether it's the Chicago School or other areas, but in some ways I felt it had been done. I'm not saying it couldn't be done again or differently, but to me it was much more about a reported investigative journalism book. Yes, to give some historical context about why these things are happening, but more importantly, to actually go to various places and see how these policies, which are designed in Moscow or London or New York or Canberra or somewhere else like that, are affecting people in remote places around the world, but also often in the countries themselves. And I think too often in much of the media coverage of, say, war or detention centres or even the refugee crisis currently in Europe, the private aspect of it, the companies that are making money from the crisis, is too rarely talked about. And I don't think it's a conspiracy why it's not, but I think it's partly because often the media companies themselves are receiving advertising from the corporations that are making money from these issues. So I think that plays into the problem in a great way.
Well, you just mentioned Moscow, London, Washington in the same sentence, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think in terms of benefiting from, let's say, natural disasters or war, you know, the outsourcing of war, I think Moscow has had a much modest and limited experience than, let's say, Washington.
I would agree. There's no doubt about that. Obviously, Russia's foreign policy since the end of the Cold War has been quite different to the United States. The United States obviously has been an expansionist and aggressive power since the Second World War, if not before. Russia obviously has had various wars in its region, but also beyond. I think in the last few years, though, the Putin regime in Russia certainly is being more assertive in its foreign policy. Some of it I agree with, much of it I don't. But I think the difference is that it's not as established in Russia to have massive private corporations making money from war. I'm not saying people are not doing that, including the arms industry. It's happening. But I was focusing particularly, I think, on the world's greatest power, which is America, and the corporations particularly which are involved there, but also beyond, including here in London and the UK, where I think we often too rarely examine and want to look at how corporations are making money, why it doesn't really matter in, say, America or Britain or Australia, my country, who's in power. The economic system is set in such a way that whether it's through a lobbying system or any kind of ideological belief, it seems to make more sense for many politicians, in my view falsely, to outsource, for example, immigration to a private corporation. And clearly when it comes to, for example, the arms industry or weapons, or for that matter, private security firms, there's no incentive for those corporations to do it in a way that is accountable, because the governments themselves in the host countries and the original countries have set it up in such a way that, for example, in Afghanistan and Iraq, private American contractors rarely, if ever, face justice in the Afghan or Iraqi legal system, because it was seen that it wasn't appropriate to be done there, and therefore they were flown back to America to maybe face justice, but often they weren't.
Let me seize on that point, because I think it's a very interesting one. This idea of war outsourcing that both you and Naomi Klein raised. And you both make the case that, again, this model is exactly what allows the conflicts to drag on indefinitely, because certain people are making money out of that. But I wonder if that concept is becoming a little bit outdated due to the changing nature of modern warfare and the shift towards proxy conflicts, because I would argue that the type of war contracting that we saw Blackwater do is only possible when you have a full-scale invasion, and this is not something that any given country can afford easily these days.
That's true to an extent, but I would disagree with you as well, because in, say, Iraq and Afghanistan, there's no doubt that the US troop presence in Iraq is gone, but there's a lot of private security. In Afghanistan, there is still a US troop presence, but there are far more contractors. But in some ways, the occupations have been rebranded. They're different to 2001 and 2003, you're absolutely correct. And in Libya, for example, or now in Syria, there's no doubt that it is a proxy war involving countless countries. But I think we have to remember that when war is outsourced, it's not just private security. It's also, for example, and Jeremy Scahill, the American author, has written a book and film called Dirty Wars, talks in great deal about this, and Edward Snowden, the NSA whistleblower who obviously has asylum currently in Moscow in Russia. So much of what the NSA has been doing, so much of what the US does to gather intelligence is controlled and run by private corporations. That to me is still outsourcing war. And I think one of the things that really comes out so strongly in the Snowden documents, which is so relevant, is what the US and its allies mostly want the intelligence for is not, despite what they claim, to fight terrorism, but actually to give their corporations' economic benefit when it comes to making money. So you're right to the extent that the Afghan and Iraqi wars have changed, but let's not forget I've been in Afghanistan twice in the last few years, and another area of war making in a different way that's been outsourced is a resource and mining industry in Afghanistan. That's not people who are holding a gun, but they're benefiting from the war having been outsourced in the first place.
Well, Mr. Levinson, I think one other way of outsourcing wars is expressed pretty straightforwardly in President Obama's doctrine of leading from behind, when certain actions are delegated to America's regional allies who can do it fairly freely under the cloud, under the protective cloud of American power. And what's interesting in that is that we have the same type of weaponry flowing into the same conflict zones. But what is new is that it is not exclusively American taxpayers who are paying for that. Some of the bills are picked up by regional players, for example, Turkey or Saudi Arabia, in the case of Syria, for example. What do you think about this diversification of sources of funding?
Well, for the people on the ground, the civilians in, say, Syria, it makes it worse. I mean, whether it's Saudi weapons or Saudi money or US or British or Australian, the bombs are still falling on civilians. I mean, Syria, of course, has been apocalyptic. I think really the outsourcing of war to regional players has not made the problem any better. In fact, arguably it's made the problem worse. Let's look at what's happening in Yemen, for example. America knows that the Saudi regime, one of the most brutal, repressive, misogynist regimes in the world, is indiscriminately bombing civilians in Yemen under the guise of apparently fighting terrorism. The truth is the US, despite knowing that, is still allowing US weapons makers to ship new weapons to the Saudi regime. That, to me, is the outsourcing of war in the most cynical and brutal way. And then we wonder why so often you see in much of the Middle East and elsewhere, not just cynicism towards US interests, but people on the ground know what's going on. Yemenis know that they're being bombed because of American weapons. Egyptian civilians who are being tortured in Egyptian jails know that President Sisi's regime is being armed, funded and trained by America, and for that matter Israel. That to me is a fundamental problem with how our world is ordered, and to question that and to challenge that and to say the US weapons industry and the Russian industry and the Israeli weapons industry and the French weapons industry is benefiting hugely financially for a continuation of the old wars but also the beginning of new ones.
But Mr. Levinson, with all due respect, I think one major distinction between the ways Russian weapons industry operates from the American one is that Russians are at least operating on legal contracts that have been signed with a legitimate and UN-recognized government. Whatever you think about that government, you know, it is done transparently. What we have in the case of, let's say, Saudi, Turkish, or even American involvement in Syria or even Libya is not transparent and it's not accountable. Isn't that the main issue here?
It's different, I agree, but I would say that a lot of the contracts that the US is signing, the US government, I mean, with American corporations is often secret, but they're not illegal. I mean, they are legal. One of the problems, I think, which I talk about a lot in my book, particularly in relation to the US, is the fact that money during an election campaign has fundamentally corrupted the system. So let me give you a very quick example. So say there are in Britain a lot of the detention centres for refugees, for immigrants, is run by private corporations. Those corporations routinely give massive amounts of money to political parties and candidates. That is a legal, to me, bribe. In America, you have a very similar situation where weapons companies, arms industries, and detention camps and prison organisations, companies are giving huge amounts of money legally to congressmen and women to run their campaign. And ultimately, until you remove the issue of massive amounts of money, legalise corruption, there's no way that there's going to be a smaller arms industry or less outsourced wars or less prisons and detention camps running for profit. That is the key issue here. And you're right, in Russia it's a different system, and I know far more about what's happening in the US than there, but I know there's a degree, obviously, of a weapons industry that operates in Russia that sells weapons, obviously, to various regimes around the world. But in the US and in Britain particularly, it's almost, I think, seen somehow, it's defended as democracy or supporting freedom or whatever nonsense language might be used, but the reality is in many places, particularly in, say, Yemen now or Syria or Palestine for that matter, the civilians in those countries know where the bombs are coming from. They're the ones who are suffering on the ground, and they don't really care for themselves whether it comes from the US government or a private corporation or anyone, but for those of us who investigate that, I think it does matter, and we're trying to stop it.
Well, Mr. Lovenstein, I would actually argue that it does matter for people on the ground, but for the time being, let's take a very short break. When we come back, disaster capitalism may be self-serving, but isn't it also self-defeating? That's coming up in a moment on Worlds Apart. Stay tuned.
Crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want.
Here's what people have been saying about Redacted tonight.
Give it to us.
Redacted is full-on awesome.
Really?
The only show I go out of my way to watch every week. It really packs a punch. Lee Camp is the John Oliver of RT America.
They do have the same accent.
Hey, we are apparently better than boobs.
Nothing's better than boobs.
You see, people you've never heard of love Redacted tonight. The president of the World Bank, though, hates it.
He doesn't really have any taste.
Seriously, he sent us an email.
We are so discredited after the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, the chaos we caused there, the overthrow of Gaddafi, which made matters worse. The West has a terrible record of intervening only for its own interests. We've got to demonstrate a broader coalition.
Welcome back to Worlds Apart. We are discussing the capitalism of disaster and the disasters of capitalism with author and journalist Anthony Lovenstein. Mr. Lovenstein, just before the break we were discussing Syria, and there have been a number of stories recently about, for example, ISIS being in possession of a large number of Toyota pickup trucks, or, you know, certain rebel groups in Syria being supplied with TOW anti-tank missiles. And there have been evidence that there are direct connections to the American government, but what puzzles me is that there is not even an effort to conceal it. I wonder if this way of doing business or this way of doing politics has become so acceptable that nobody even feels the pressure to hide it.
Look, it's a good question. I obviously don't know exactly where some of those new vehicles for ISIS have come from. I don't know where they've come from, but I think one of the real issues in the current war against ISIS is, which is joined obviously by a number of other countries, is that the campaign that's been running now for over a year, an air campaign, simply is not working. ISIS are not degraded. In fact, the power of ISIS has increased. ISIS is gaining money, obviously, both from the oil fields that they have both in Iraq and Syria, but also, and very importantly, and this has not been investigated nearly enough, money is coming from Saudi and Qatar, which are both close US allies. That's from, I'm not saying that's coming directly from the heads of the government, but I'm saying people within the establishment in both countries. There's been some work on that to try to follow the money, so to speak. That to me really goes to the heart here of what terrorism is. That if America and its allies were serious about fighting terrorism, you actually would go to the source of much of the world's terrorism, which is Saudi Arabia. I'm not suggesting you invade and bomb them. I'm saying that you actually investigate where the money is coming from. The US
I don't think there
this.
is even any denial on the part of many American policymakers that Saudis are doing that. It's just, I guess they're allowed a little bit more than others.
Well, you're right. I mean, I guess you could argue that they know what's going on, but that makes it even more absurd. So America is fighting a war on terror against an ally. They're essentially fighting a war on terror against those in Saudi and Pakistan and elsewhere who are close US allies. And to me, it's not just self-defeating, it's kind of the definition of insanity when you're fighting countless fronts, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya. They're all different wars, but they have a connection. And the connection, I think, is a belief somehow that it goes across Democrat and Republican lines in the US, that somehow you can solve your problems through dropping bombs. And it's sort of an obvious thing to say that that doesn't actually work, but the US consistently, and many of its allies, including Britain and Australia, continually believe that not just pursuing foreign policy in that way is the way to go, but to outsource it also is the way to go.
Well, as I was reading your book, I was reminded about a recent statement by Zbigniew Brzezinski, the former U.S. National Security Advisor and still a very influential man in Washington, who said that the United States needs to protect its stakes and assets, meaning some rebel groups in Syria. And that choice of words, stakes and assets, really struck me, because those are the most capitalist words that you can find. I wonder if this type of vernacular is now replacing, you know, the old ethical and moral imperatives that policymakers usually use to justify their policies.
Well, I would argue that there hasn't really been many ethical or moral considerations in the past. They certainly frame it that way, but I mean, no one could seriously argue that, for example, the policy by Brzezinski back in Afghanistan many years ago was particularly ethical or moral. In fact, often the seeds of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda came from that period. The Carter administration, in which he was a member back in the late 70s and late 70s, supported forces that ended up becoming that. So look, I think there really is often an issue of language here, that when you see so much of media coverage, in the West particularly, about foreign policy, it's only framed around so-called experts who have a revolving door between those in government and those in privately run think tanks. And too often, the same individuals who, for example, supported the Iraq War or the Afghan War or bombing Syria or attacking Libya, who have failed time and time and time again, commentators or generals or whoever it may be, are given airtime to pontificate when they're actually saying things that everyone knows is not going to work. But the imagination or the ability for producers, I guess, in many Western TV channels to actually find someone who's critical. I mean, it's obvious to say this now, but when the run-up to the Iraq War in 2003 in much of the West, critical voices against that war were very far and few between.
Well, I think we have seen that repeated over and over again with many crises, Libya and Syria including. And you often hear that idea in the West that the revolutions, and the so-called revolutions in Libya and Syria came out of the blue, which I personally don't believe to be the case. And I don't think that it's a coincidence that those countries had policies or had a stance that was not particularly friendly to Western governments or Western corporations for that matter. But that's just my opinion. I wonder, what do you think makes countries vulnerable targets for disaster capitalists?
It depends on the country, but certainly one of the things I look at in the book is in places such as Haiti. Haiti obviously is a country very close to America. It's the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. There was an awful earthquake that hit there in January 2010. Hundreds of thousands were killed. What I look at in the book, partly through using WikiLeaks documents and others, and having spent time in Haiti in the last few years, I've been there twice, is to show that when a disaster strikes, in this case an earthquake, USAID, which is the main American aid arm, often contracts out to American contractors billions and billions of dollars to apparently try to help the Haitian people. That's the line that we're given. The truth is, on the ground in Haiti, much of the money that the US and others are giving to a relief fund stays in the host country. In other words, American contractors are receiving money that stays in the US. So Haitians, many of whom I met, are saying, well, hang on a minute, a disaster has struck. The US has pledged $10 billion to help us. We don't see any of the money. Our infrastructure has not got any better. Hillary Clinton, who was then Secretary of State, was a key advocate in Haiti of establishing so-called industrial parks, which are basically sweatshops to make clothing that people can buy in the US at Walmart or the Gap. I use that example briefly to show that when disaster strikes, a lot of people, including in the US government and the aid and development world, see a business opportunity. I'm not saying everyone in that world does, but many people do, and the system is set up in such a way that too often the people on the ground are not benefiting as they should.
Well, Mr. Levinson, despite the money staying in the host country, I think the taxpayers in any given country are not benefiting either, and you can make the case that this type of model creates more problems than it solves, and sooner or later people will wake up to that. And perhaps we've seen already the examples of that both in Europe with the refugee crisis and in the United States with the dwindling support for any type of military action. I know that, as I said, this type of capitalism, the disaster capitalism, is very self-serving, but isn't it also self-defeating? Isn't it not sustainable in the long run?
I guess it depends how you define in the long run. I mean, certainly when it comes to, for example, privatising immigration. Let's look at, say, in the UK, in Australia, in the US. There is a massive and arguably growing industry of private detention centres for the rising number of immigrants who are coming into all those countries. And one of the things that is less talked about is the way that the European Union and Europe itself is dealing with the so-called refugee crisis. One of the things that's not talked about so much is the fact that the EU very much believes in managing it through surveillance and detention rather than a humanitarian way. So not everyone's going to be thrown into a detention camp, but a lot of the money, for example, that Greece has been allowed to now access, even though there's massive austerity and huge social costs in that country, Greece has no choice but to actually use massive surveillance to manage the refugee crisis. Now that to me goes against the actual way to deal with this problem. Let's not forget, those who are making money from surveillance and drones are private corporations. That's an angle that doesn't get much coverage, and I believe that it really should.
Absolutely, and I think the problem with that is that surveillance does not always yield the results that we really want, because if you look at the number of lone wolf attacks that have been registered, both in Australia, by the way, and in Europe and the United States recently, all of those people have been under the surveillance radar, but they weren't stopped at the right time. So again, the efficacy of that type of policy is still highly questionable.
Very questionable. I mean, one of the things that's so clear since the Edward Snowden revelations in the last years is that mass surveillance doesn't actually work. The idea that somehow every American or every Australian or every Russian, for that matter, should have their entire private details, their emails, their which websites they go to, who they visit, should all be recorded and stored for some kind of what-if moment is an absurd situation, and most citizens in most countries oppose it. The problem is that you have both governments and often private corporations under the misguided belief that you collect everything. And if you collect everything, therefore, it's much easier to potentially stop a terrorist. But as I said to you before, one of the real revelations of the Snowden documents is not about countering terrorism. It's about the fact, it's principally about gaining economic benefit for American and British and Australian and New Zealand corporations. There's nothing necessarily, well, it's problematic in terms of the fact it's not honestly said to be like that, but we should ask ourselves, why are we not being told that? Why is it framed as protecting us from terrorism, and in fact it's about American corporations getting more money on the bottom line? That's, and often done in an incredibly illegal way as well. That's the problem.
Mm-hmm. You just mentioned citizens in many of those countries, and I think they're already reacting negatively. I mean, if you look at the polls, and I heard you personally attribute the rise of Golden Dawn in Greece as well as other far-right parties across Europe to this feeling that the European Union is not a democratic body. I think I would argue at least that Jeremy Corbyn in the UK and perhaps both Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump in the United States are trying to tap into this very same feeling, even though I do admit that their constituency has subscribed to very different ideologies. Nevertheless, do you think this feeling of resentment or this feeling of the necessity of change that voters in many countries feel, do you think it can be actually translated in any actual change?
Well, yes, to the extent that there has been, as you rightly say. I'm not sure I'd say Donald Trump necessarily. He's very much a man of the establishment who is framing himself against the political.
But he's using the feeling. I'm not saying that he's subscribing to that genuinely, but...
Totally right, absolutely right. And Bernie Sanders does, and certainly Jeremy Corbyn here in the UK. I think one of the things that's very clear, there is a real crisis in political legitimacy. And that comes through, apart from what you said with those individuals in various countries, in the fact that in a lot of nations that are polled, it's the first time that most of the polling companies say that when individuals are asked, do they believe that the future is going to be better for their children than them? Is their life going to be better? Is their economic situation going to be better? Most people say it won't be, that they actually fear that their economic situation is worsening. The middle class is losing salaries rather than gaining them. And to me, the solution is not simply to embrace, for example, a two-party system. There needs to be, I think, a far greater choice and also a belief that politics is not just about the best-looking person and the soundbite. And Jeremy Corbyn, it's only early days since he's become leader here in the UK, showed through becoming, as an opposition leader, the most popularly elected British leader in history, that there is a growing constituency of people who say, we don't think that politics as usual is the way to go here, that privatising our social services is not the answer, that going to war is not the answer. These views are routinely either demonised or ignored or made fun of in much of the mainstream corporate press, but in fact they represent a mainstream view.
Absolutely. And Mr. Lovenstein, we have to wrap it up, but I only want to add that I think people in many, or voters in many of those developed Western countries also need to recognize the type of grief, deprivation, disaster that is visited in that name on people in other countries, especially when you try to outsource wars. I think we have had a significant deficit of accountability, not only on the part of politicians, but on the part of electorate in many of the countries that deem themselves democratic. But we have to leave it there. I really, really appreciate you being on the show. And to our viewers, please share your thoughts in our Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook pages. And I hope to see you again, same place, same time, here on Worlds Apart.
Tioga, a little town of maybe 600 people, has to be supporting 8,000 people now.
Even in Florida, in the papers and on the news, it's come to North Dakota.
This is the place to be.
I'm not living off of hope, but I am hopeful. I'm living off what is going to happen. It's like we've been invaded by some big foreign blob that is out to get rid of my place, get rid of my very being.
عملت ايه يا كبد؟ شاور يا بيض، شاور على صورة بابا. حط ايدك لتحت كده. جوزي ملاك راح السما.
بعد ظهور الفيديو العجيب هنا ان الناس كلها كانت بتصلي من اجل داعش.
دول دخلاء علشان يشوهوا صورة الإسلام، لأن الإسلام ده دين الرحمة.
أي نعم إن الخوف كان مالينا، عايزين نهرب منهم، بس لو كنا نعرف إن آخرتهم كده درجة عظيمة كنا فتحنا ورحنا معاهم.
حياة
حياته زي الزفت والله ولا رايح عن بالي دقيقة. فلما منظر حمية بس مين اللي هيتكلموا تاني؟
The stories which shaped the week here on RT International. Turkey downs a Russian bomber near the Syrian border, saying it violated its airspace. But Moscow insists the jet was attacked in Syrian skies. As one of the jet's